of religion in charitable giving. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm joined today by two of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. David King and Rafia Khader, and they are the co-authors of Chapter 27 of Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, the fifth edition that came out in 2022, which is the role of religion in giving. And David, let me start with you. Just, kind of a big picture question. What is the role of religion in charitable giving?
That's a great question, Bill. As long as we've been tracking with maybe Giving USA as an example, religion has been the largest subsector of the charitable giving pie in the United States, around 27% over this past year, which is still basically double the next biggest subsector. So giving to religion, even narrowly defined, is basically congregations, denominations, religious media, makes up the largest percentage of the subsectors. But we also know that religion is an important motivator to the variety of faith-based nonprofits across the country that make up many of the other subsectors, and as a motivator for why people give. They volunteer, they give more, and they give more not only to religious organizations, which you might imagine for religious individuals, but to secular nonprofits too. So looking at the religious organizations that provide so many services across our U.S. Nonprofit sector, as well as the motivations for individuals themselves to a wide variety of causes.
And Rafia, why is this? Obviously, many different religions in the United States and around the world, many different religious traditions and followings. Are there some, just common motivations that we understand across the religious landscape?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when we take a look at the different religions across the spectrum, we see that giving really is in the heart of the foundations of all the religious traditions. And what we see when we look at a religion overall, the biggest motivator really for religious giving and people of faith in particular, when they give, whether they're giving to religious organizations or even secular organizations, is this out of this personal conviction in their belief in God and to deepen the relationship with their creator. So that's the number one thing that we found in our research. So the second motivation for religious givers is also to receive reciprocity with their religious community and in their larger organizations. A third motivator that we see is this expression of gratitude for one's blessings in life, and also to express their altruism. And so those are some things that we see across the spectrum, across different religious faith traditions in motivations for their giving.
What a wonderful summary. My relationship with the transcendent, my relationship with the congregation, and my relationship with my community as I express my gratitude. A lot of common themes throughout different religious traditions across the world. David, any changes, any shifts that we've been seeing lately?
Yeah, there are some changes, I think, in how we track religious giving and how religion motivates our giving. And one thing that we continue to track is that there are declines in affiliation patterns. Fewer Americans are affiliating with a religious tradition or are members of a local faith community like a congregation. And maybe the attendance patterns are changing. Maybe people are going to temple, mosque, or their church less often than they used to. And so this oftentimes were some of the key trackers, attendance and affiliation for how we sort of measured how religion motivates this giving in this way. And so it's worth noting how those religious practices, whether it's listening to a sermon, being part of a community, and being in touch with greater needs, how those shifts are starting to change maybe the landscape. One thing that we're more and more interested in is pointing to, just because traditional religious affiliation or membership may be changing, that doesn't close off how religion and spirituality and values continues to shape and motivate giving. So looking at a variety of spiritual practices and the values oftentimes passed on through families or communities, whether that means someone is sort of in church or at mosque every week, are open questions. And we need to be attentive, particularly as fundraisers, and to how those spiritual practices and values continue to shape our giving, even if they might be tracking in different ways than what we might have expected a generation ago.
Rafi, I'd like to ask you, please, to amplify on David's answer there, as we see a growing diversity in religious belief, just in the United States context, for example, knowing that there's significant diversity around the world as well. But also, as David mentioning, more and more Americans not identifying with a particular religion. What are some of the implications for fundraisers and charitable giving as we're seeing this shift in the religious landscape in the United States?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. So what we've seen, according to Pew Research, is that the second largest, I guess, religious group are the unaffiliated. And so the natural assumption might be that these people, they don't care about spirituality. They don't care anything about causes that might be religious, like Catholic Charities, for example. But there was a study done by the Fester Institute in 2020, and what they found is that actually around 60% of Americans actually do find like spiritual meaning in their philanthropic activity. And so it's really important for fundraisers to not discount the disaffiliated just because they're not a member of a particular house of worship, and if they don't identify with any particular denomination. And so I think that's really important. And
Yep, it's such a key aspect of charitable giving to know, some people use the word religion and others use the word spirituality. And, again, we have wonderful, talented researchers like David and Rafael are helping us to kind of dig deeper on these data to understand our donors who do have a religious or a spiritual motivation. David, that also, we saw an interesting shift during the pandemic, right? Everything was shifted online for a while at most religious congregations. One of the things that the belief was that, religious giving was so high because, as you mentioned earlier, people were in their congregation every week. So the congregational leader could ask for that charitable giving, could remind them of their particular religious or spiritual teaching. What did we see during the pandemic as it relates to religious giving? And now, in the wake of what we hope is the worst of the pandemic, what trends are emerging?
Well, that's a great question, Bill. And I think at Lake Institute, I know in the School of Philanthropy, this is a pressing question for us: is what do we learn through that through the pandemic, and what might it mean for the future? And in many ways, we think that, most congregations, which is the bulk of religious giving, continued to do quite well during the pandemic. And I think part of that was the natural rhythms of religious giving and how many of those organizations, those nonprofits, were first responders to meeting the needs, whether that's spaces for kids to do online school or to meet needs around food or housing, these kinds of immediate needs. And the rhythms of continuing to give were already in place. And so, shifting quickly to online giving, for instance, solved a lot of the early problems where many congregations or nonprofits who hadn't made that shift already and were sort of easy, low-hanging fruit wins for nonprofits. And as we moved deeper and deeper through the pandemic over the last few years, finding ways to continue to ask to present need was a growing question for nonprofits and congregations in particular. As we're coming out of it now, what we do see is that returns to attendance patterns have changed. And so many people are engaging or continuing to engage in an online way. But I think the open question is, does online engagement present the same benefits or opportunities as engaging in person? It's an open question, I think, for a lot of nonprofits, particularly for the faith community.
And the congregational leaders might answer that question one way, and the congregants might answer the question another way, which is also part of this complex dynamic that we see with religious behavior and what that means for charitable giving. I asked David the question about the pandemic. Each of the chapters in the 5th edition of Achieving Excellence in Fundraising deals with what happens during times of crises like the pandemic. But Rafael, we also address one in each chapter to talk about social justice and social reconciliation, and racial reconciliation, all of the issues that reemerged in wonderful, difficult, challenging, but important ways in 2020. And I'm just kind of curious, what is the context of religion in that regard, where sometimes some of these disagreements are across religious lines, but I know with your affiliation with the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative, as part of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which David leads at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, that you and your colleagues are looking to say, how do we cross lines of distinction? How do we bring people together with a religious lens? How can people understand religion and charitable giving in the context of social justice?
right. I think the events of 2020 were a pivotal moment, which caused a lot of Americans and actually across the world to really think about race in a way that they hadn't. Not to say that race wasn't talked about, but globally, I think religious congregations and religious organizations also had to take heart to and see how are our traditions, how are our teachings attributing to this context that we find ourselves in. I mean, I remember right after the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2022, my colleagues at Lake Institute and at the School of Philanthropy too were actually thinking about like what role does philanthropy play? And we had several focus group conversations with religious nonprofit leaders and congregational leaders, and they talked about some of the frankly harmful effects of some of their historical teachings regarding to slavery, whether it was mandated by God or rather permissible by God, or whether it was abolition was something that was commanded by God. So there was something going on that I think that really got to this debate within religious communities. And specifically to speak about the Muslim community as well, this was also a time where we also deeply reflected on how our practices were contributing to the problem. In my previous research, I looked at race within the Muslim community and how mosques tend to be segregated along race. Arab mosques tend to or the community tends to go along with the Arab mosques, and the South Asian community usually tends to go into predominantly South Asian mosques. And then African American Muslims, which are a lot, actually, they make up a good portion of the Muslims in the United States. They tend to go in separate mosques. And so a lot of faith leaders were really thinking about why this was happening. And if we wanted to address some of these problems, we had to become more integrated. And so we started having conversations pertaining to race. The Muslim ARC, which is the Muslim Anti-Racist Collective, started doing workshops amongst the Muslim community to really get this conversation started, because the voices of African American Muslims, they were leaders in the history of Islam in this country, but their voices were marginalized, and they really tried to uplift their voices and their experience amongst the larger American Muslim community.
Rafia, thank you for your transparency there. But I also know, your work and your colleagues is also, searching for where do we find those interfaith areas of intersection as well. And that's so important to cross those lines of distinction to come together philanthropically and out in the community. I'd like the same question in conclusion for both of you. And that is, if I'm with a faith-based nonprofit, okay, I understand my faith. I understand my folks who I worship with, who kind of, I run with on the weekends when it's time for religious worship. I'm always curious about the secular nonprofit. And David, you touched on this a little bit in your opening remarks. Do the secular nonprofits say, well, okay, I'm out, right? Yeah, I'm not in that particular religious faith. But actually the opposite is true. As you said, that, religious motivation can lead to all sorts of charitable giving. So kind of last word from both of you. David, I'll start with you, and then Rafia, ask you to continue. What advice do you have for fundraisers, especially in non-religious nonprofit organizations, when they find out that a donor has religious motivation as part of their charitable values?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. And I would say up first, before we're looking at individual donors, is to look at other fellow nonprofits in that sector. So there may be faith-based and secular nonprofits that can come together around a shared issue. Maybe it's climate, maybe it's particular kind of homelessness or poverty. What we're seeing more and more are secular organizations and secular philanthropy that are embracing a variety of faith-based actors across the spectrum. These become sort of uncommon collaborations where we can work together around a common cause. As much as religion sometimes divides us in our society and become a polarizing force, particularly around faith and giving, we do think it can be a uniting sense of kind of common purpose across faiths and across faith, religious and secular divides. But looking at religious individual donors, if we're not tapping into the passions and values of our donor base, we know that's the primary motivation for donors. Whether those are faith-based or other types of motivations, but thinking through, what are the values and passions and motivators for individuals that are giving in a wide variety of ways, I think we're missing the chance to connect with our donors for the cause that we represent.
Rafia, same question. If I'm at a secular nonprofit and I know somebody's observant in their Muslim faith, Christian faith, their First Nation with their Native American spiritual beliefs, whatever the case might be, am I out, or how do I intersect with that donor?
Not at all. So while for religious givers, they're highly motivated by their religion to give, what that actually means, and I'm to borrow from the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, which is repairing the world, it's not confined to just my community. It affects the entire world. So animals, the environment, all that stuff, it should be important to the deeply religious giver. And one thing that I will say, just to look at particular, so when we did some research on the philanthropic activity of the Jewish community in the United States, up to 40% of their giving actually goes to non-Jewish related organizations. So that's significant. You can't discount that. And then looking at the Muslim American community as well, even though the mosque tends to be the highest recipient of Muslim American giving, they also give to civil rights organizations, and they're also very, very interested in domestic poverty alleviation. They're not giving their money just away to, countries back home. They really are concerned about helping the poor in this country, and that's regardless of faith. That's something that is deeply that a lot of Muslims are very deeply committed to.
Well, we are just so grateful for the expertise of Rafia Khader as well as David King, taking what is a very complex topic with many different angles, many different understandings, and helping us understand the role of religion in giving. And we have just scratched the surface here. You really need to dive into chapter 27 of the 5th edition of Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, which is available on our website at the Fundraising School at philanthropy.iupui.edu/the Fundraising School. You will also find information about our public courses, our custom training, our quarterly webinars, and these free podcasts. And if you go just one spot over on that toolbar across the top of the website, you'll find institutes. Click there, and down comes the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which has a certificate in religious fundraising training for our folks in religious congregations and with spiritual motivations, custom training as well, a wide range of unique research that literally is sought out nationally and internationally. David leads that institute for us. Rafi is a key colleague in the work of the Lake Institute, and you can find information about the Lake Institute as well. So again, philanthropy.iupui.edu. Go across the top toolbar, you'll see the Fundraising School. One slide over, you'll see Institutes. The draw-down menu there will take you to the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. I'm so grateful for my colleagues joining me today, David King and Rafia Khader. Our producers today, Jennifer Poffman and Mike Anthony. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, and now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the Fundraising School.